What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, what I'd like to do is go over how we can actually search within HTML documents for different types of elements according to whatever our needs are. This is going to be a series of videos over the next couple of videos where we're actually going to be doing things like searching through a document for elements, creating our own elements, updating elements, as well as deleting elements from the DOM. All these operations are super important to hammer down so that you feel really comfortable doing all these things within the DOM with vanilla JavaScript and DOM methods. Let's just get right to querying to see how this actually looks using the querySelector syntax. Okay, so to start, I would just like to pose this question to you, right? So we know that we can access our HTML from our JavaScript using the DOM API, right? So for example, we can ask things of the DOM like grab the current element that I have selected, right? So previously, how we've been doing this using the dev tools was by using things like the $0, $1, 2, 3, and things like that, where we can actually select an element in the Elements tab and then actually print it out in the console and do things with it and look at the properties. So it'd be nice if we could actually do that without needing the dev tools per se. We could actually do that within our JavaScript, for example, and grab an element and actually do things with it and maybe even change it and put it back into the DOM. That would be super awesome. So really the first step for that, if we're talking about the existing elements, which means ones that we haven't had to create from scratch, how do we do that? Well, we need a way to kind of reach into the DOM and ask it a question, right? We want to be able to ask for things like, hey, I want the title, right? Or I want this meow, right? So we need to figure out how we can kind of structure this query, this question, to the DOM API so that it can actually respond to us. All right. So it turns out that this is such a common operation, as you might expect, that there's actually a very nice, smooth API built into modern JavaScript DOM API for us to actually use. So that's the purpose of this video, and that's this guy right here. We're going to be talking about the querySelector API in this particular video. So let's take a look at what this is all about, because it's actually super, super powerful. We're going to go quite deep so we actually understand a bit of the power that we can actually use to make our jobs a bit easier. So let's start with this HTML that I have over here on the left-hand side. Okay, so I've kind of color-coded it so the head and the body are in different sections, as well as the overall document or the HTML page itself. Now, what we can do is we can do things like grab the document root, and we can do .querySelector on it. This is a method on this document object that's provided as to us by the DOM API, specifically in JavaScript in this case. All right. Now, the way that this API works, I'll show you in a second. And when I keep saying API, basically in this case, I'm just meaning how this function actually expects to be used. Specifically, this parameter right here, which is the only real parameter for querySelector, and how that actually functions behind the scenes and how we can actually take advantage of it. So in this case, let's assume that we're using document. We can do .querySelector, and we can give it something which we don't know yet, and we can search somehow in this document with some kind of question. All right, so like maybe we're saying, hey, give me, the title in the document, or give me the paragraph tag or the body tag or something like that. All right. Now this querySelector works directly off the document object, which is the root of the DOM tree in our HTML. However, we can actually search from any element inside of the HTML. Now this is extremely powerful and a really important concept to nail down. So let me kind of go through it a little bit further. For example, the document object has a body property which actually points to this green section right here. Everything inside of the body tag is contained inside of the body property of the DOM API, which is also part of the document, which is part of the DOM API as well. So if we only care about the body, we can actually do document.body and we can grab everything in there. But if we do querySelector on that, since the body is also an element, querySelector works on any element, we can actually search directly within the body and ignore things like the head and other things that might be outside the body, which is pretty handy. In fact, this is so handy that technically down here, I have this syntax, which is we can use any element node, right? As long as we have an element node and a reference to element node, we can do .querySelector on it and then pass it some question, and we can search within that element's subtree. This is really powerful. I'm going to repeat that one more time because it's so crucial to understand. Each of these DOM nodes exists effectively, you can think of in like a hierarchy, in a tree. For example, the HTML is the root, right? Everything is contained within the HTML except for the doc type. Okay, so in this case, we can say that the HTML has a head and a body, right? Not too different from ourselves. And inside of the head, there are specific things that go inside the head tag. For example, like a title. We might have script tags or style tags in the head. Usually we wouldn't put those in something like the body. The body, conversely, would have all the content usually. Maybe like the nav bar, the footer, headers, paragraphs, cards, all that kind of fun stuff, right? So if we want to search within a kind of child, and we'll get to the syntax and kind of the nomenclature, which is the naming conventions for all these things, like the parent and the child and the nodes and the elements and the before and the after and prepending and appending and all that kind of stuff later. But for now, it's important to notice that, for example, I can say that if I was searching just within this div that I have highlighted right here, there's only one thing in this div, which is the meow paragraph tag, right? However, if I talk about this body, well, technically this body has two things directly inside of it, but three things in total. So it has an h1 and a div in it, right? But then that div also has a paragraph in it, right? And we can keep kind of going up and up and up and up and then down and down and down and down as we need to kind of scope up and scope down how detailed we need to be in our query. So for example, if I'm never interested in anything up over here, I probably would only search the body. Or maybe I'm only interested in whatever's inside this div, I would directly grab that div and start searching from there. I would kind of ignore everything outside of that div. Okay, so for now, just keep this at the back of your mind. We'll kind of look at this in a second because I think the documentation for this explains it pretty well. Okay, so before we get to docs, I just want to kind of mention this. So I've kind of been like walking around this idea of, well, what do we give as an argument to this querySelector function, right? I mentioned it's a question of some kind, right? So what this actually is, the sole argument to this querySelector function or method is a string, all right? But it's a special string. It is what's called a CSS selector, okay? Now, if you've done CSS before, this might sound familiar. If not, don't worry. We'll kind of go through a resource that'll help us a little bit with this. I'm not going to spend too much time on what a CSS selector really is, apart from the fact that it's the exact same thing that we would write inside of our CSS files, which is what we use to style our document, to actually select different parts of the document to actually style in specific ways. For example, we might say, hey, can you please style all the paragraphs on the page like a light blue, right? And then that would have a specific CSS selector that would select all the paragraphs. All of those selectors that are available in CSS are available to us in the querySelector API. The same selector string that we would put in the CSS is the same thing we would use to target and ask for those nodes or those elements in querySelector as well. So that's why I love this API. Right? I'm not that great at CSS myself, definitely need more practice with it, but I kind of understand the basics my way around it. So having a kind of a same syntax or the same API between CSS and then the querySelector is really, really nice. Okay, so in this case, for example, as you can see on my screen, I have document.querySelector of h1 as a string, right? So what we're saying here in plain English is, can you please go and find all of the, or in this case, the first h1 element on the document, starting exactly at the document root. So what's going to happen is this arrow right here that you see I have pointing down, right? The algorithm is going to start at the top of the document and it's going to work its way down until it finds an h1 or until it hits the end of the document, whichever happens first. In this case, we do have an h1 right here, and it's going to give us back that h1 node, which in this case is an HTML heading element, and we're actually able to grab that and get a reference to it in JavaScript through the DOM API. All right, so here what we're saying is please grab the first H1 starting at the document root and return it back to us if you can find one, otherwise give us back null. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I'm going to pull up my browser. I'm going to pull up Google. I'm just going to search for querySelector. Okay, and I hope that you have MDN kind of at the back of your mind every time we look at documentation together. I think it's really the fantastic and the the kind of the gold standard of documentation, at least for web APIs and the DOM and JavaScript. So if I go to MDN here, let me zoom in a little bit. This is document.querySelector. Okay, I highly encourage you to actually read through this. It's quite short. They have some great examples on here, and it might kind of give you a bit of a tingling feeling as you kind of like, oh, that's how that works, and this is what it accepts. Okay, so let's just read this really quick. The document method querySelector returns the first element, right, within the document. In this case, literally the document that matches the specified selector or a group of selectors. So you can actually pass it a group of selectors, which is kind of cool. If no matches are found, then null is returned. Right? And you can get, it gets all fancy here. It uses a depth first pre-order traversal of the documents node, basically a tree traversal algorithm, which if you've studied data structures and algorithms, you might kind of ring a few bells over there. Okay, so the most important thing here is that it returns the first element, right, that matches, and if it doesn't find a match, it returns null. So you can read all about how this selector works over here, how you can pass in multiple selectors. The return value over here, you can read all about that. They have some examples of how that all works and really complex examples and a bit on the spec as well. And you can see that this works in pretty much every single browser. And even for super old browsers, which I'll mention towards the end of this video, generally we want to still use this, and we get kind of translated by tools like Babel that would actually make it work with other APIs pretty seamlessly. So generally you always want to use querySelector when you're doing DOM searches. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So the confusing part here is, well, what is a selector, right? So I'm going to pull up another Google tab and I'm going to search for CSS Selectors. Okay, and I'm going to, again, use MDN as documentation. So if I might have to scroll down a little bit here, you can see MDN has a CSS Selectors, CSS Cascading Style Sheets link. I'm going to click on that one. And over here, you can see that it says that CSS selectors define the pattern to select elements to which a set of CSS rules are then applied. Okay, so there's all these different categories of selectors. This is definitely not the most exciting read in the world. And quite frankly, it's not actually really very useful until you actually start using these. I would just encourage you to give a quick glance through these just so you know the most common ones, specifically the basic ones. Okay. I'll mention them as well, but it's just kind of nice to know some of these basic ones. These other really fancy ones you'll eventually maybe use here and there, especially if you're coding in CSS specifically. However, not necessary in order to learn querySelector, at least to start. In fact, I probably know about like 10% of the CSS selectors. Actually, probably even less. So definitely don't fret if you're worried about CSS. Okay, the main ones are here, which is the basic ones. Again, quite good to actually read through this as well as the querySelector previously. Speaking of querySelector, I'm going to switch back to this really quick. And I believe if I scroll down to the very bottom of this querySelector page, if I scroll down to the very bottom, you'll see there's a See Also section. You'll notice that there's also an element.querySelector. Okay, there's a querySelectorAll, which we'll get to shortly, but I'm going to click on this elements.querySelector. And you can see that this is a method of element, right, that returns the first element of the descendant of the element for that selector. So we don't actually have to use it on the document because, again, the document is just an element. We can use it on any element in the DOM tree so we can restrict the search to that particular part of the DOM. Okay, we're going to be using this a lot. Very, very powerful, super awesome. Okay, so let's switch back here. Let's actually just code this up and actually see an example because I think there's a lot of talking right now and not very much coding, which is a bit odd for a programming video. So let's actually switch over to VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this, let's do querySelector.html. All right, and here I'm just going to add my doc type at the very top, doc type HTML. Then I'm going to do HTML over here. And I'm actually just going to flip back and forth and copy this. So I'm going to have a head with a title. So I'm going to have a head, and then inside of here, I'm going to have a title. And inside the title, I'll just say hello or something like that. Then after the head comes a body. And then inside the body, I'm going to have an H1. So I'm going to have an H1. I'm going to say hello there. Or I think I said welcome. Let's do welcome just so it's a little bit more consistent with what I have there. And then I have a div. And this is a divider, so just a section on the page. And inside of this div, I'm going to put a p tag, which is going to say meow. And I'm just going to put an emoji for fun as well. What I'm going to mess with as all, I'm going to put a monkey for the meow, just to make sure y'all are paying attention. Okay, so let's go with that, right? So this is our HTML page. I'm going to right click on this, reveal in Finder, and then I'm going to double click on my querySelector.html and it should open up in Chrome. All right, so there we go. That's my beautiful monkey, meow, and welcome. I'm gonna open up my DevTools over here on the right-hand side. I'm gonna zoom in a whole bunch here. And I'm going to go to the Elements tab here, and we can see that inside of head, we have the title, inside of body, we have our div, and then we have our p tag inside of the div. And you can see as we're kind of highlighting these different sections, right? Chrome is nice enough to actually tell us what those entire elements look like on the page when it comes to like where they're actually physically located, which is pretty nice. Okay, so previously what we did was we used this $0 and then we could do $1 to refer to the previous element and 2, etc., etc. But it'd be nice to actually do this through the real APIs because $0 is not part of the DOM API. That's something that the Chrome developer tools or the Firefox developer tools gives to us to make things easier. But we need something that's part of the standard so we can use it in JavaScript to refer to in any of our code. Okay, so I'm going to switch to our console here. So in here, I'd like to actually start showing you this query selector. So let's take a look at this. So if I start with the document, let's see what happens. So I'm going to say document.querySelector, and actually, before I do this, I'm just going to do query S, capital S, and it's a bit cut off on my screen, but you can kind of see that there's a few different things we can do, specifically querySelector and querySelectorAll. We're going to look at querySelectorAll in a second, but I'm just going to go with querySelector. And in here, we're going to pass it a string, which is the CSS selector that we're interested in. So if I actually switch back to my Elements tab, let's take a look at the title, for example. Let's say I'm interested in the title tag for this DOM. So if I say I'm interested in the title and then I press enter, what I'll get back is the title, right? Which is pretty awesome. And you can see that this is the hello title right here. Now I can do this for pretty much anything. I can say instead of the title, I want the H1 and I'll grab the H1, right? I can say I want the paragraph and I'll get the paragraph, right? So this is pretty powerful. You can see that this is basically going out to the DOM and returning the first match it finds for that CSS selector. Okay, emphasis on the first match it finds, because if we want more than that, we're gonna have to try something else. Okay, now let's come back here and let's think about this second scenario. What if we had another element and we wanted to find the second one? So in this example, I have two H1 tags. Okay. Normally you wouldn't have two H1 tags on a page because semantically and for screen readers, you only really want one major heading per page because it means something and has some semantic relevance. But just for sake of example, on this particular document, I'm just going to put two H1s just to show you how this would work. This would work with any different type of element, just to be clear. Now, let's say I wanted to grab the second H1 here, which is cap log. All right. How would I do that, right? So let's go back to our code and let's add, after this div, let's add another H1 tag and let's do cat blog. This is getting a bit confusing because now I have meow, a monkey, and cat blog. So I'm a bit kind of confused as to what's going on with our web page, but that's okay. For now, sake of example, let's come back in here. So we still have to reload our page. So I'm just going to Command R, Control R, or you can click the reload button in the top over here. And there we go. We have our cat blog. Just be mindful that by default, when you do refresh the page, unless you have some settings enabled in the console, all of your consoles are going to get wiped. Okay, Now, if we head back to our elements, we can see in our body that now we have our second H1 in here, along which is after our welcome H1, the one right here that says cap block. So if I come back to the console now and I say document.querySelector and I say an H1, right, I'm going to get the welcome H1, right? So this really begs the question, how do we get cap block? Right now, I know some of you watching this video might know how to do this, but I really want to kind of go through this slowly so it makes sense as to what we're doing, because this is actually going to be a build up to very complicated DOM selection that we're going to be doing later on, especially once we start building our own subtrees for our elements. So it's really crucial that we understand all the different reasonings for why these things work behind the scenes. Okay, so it turns out that well, let's go through one way to start. And that's probably one of the more common ways. So, which is this, right? Generally speaking, we would add attributes to our different elements, right? So there's many different attributes, for example, IDs and classes and like all these different ones like checked and like unchecked, I guess, and all these different ones that you can add to different types of elements depending on what the element is. But the most common ones really, apart from the custom ones, are ID and class. Okay, so we'll see how we can select from those. But in this particular case, what I've done is I've added an ID attribute to my second H1, but left the first H1 alone. Okay, so that's highlighted here in the purple. So I've added an ID equals and then as a string block. So let's go to our code and actually do that. So in my second H1 here, I'm going to add a space. I'm going to say ID equals a string, so double quotes, and I'm going to say block. All right. So this is saying that tag this H1 node or element with the ID property of block. All right, so I'm going to switch back here. What we can do is we can actually use querySelector with the CSS selector that's meant to select IDs, which is the hashtag, to grab that specific H1. Okay, so the way that this would look is, in this case, if we started the document, we could do querySelector, hashtag, and then the ID name. So in this case, hashtag blog would select an element that has an ID of blog. And we would get back this HTML heading element right here, which is the second one instead of the first one. So let's take a look at that and see if that works. So I'm going to reload my terminal here, or my Chrome, switch back and make sure that I have H1 ID blog here. This H1 has no ID, just to be super clear. Only our second one does. Now, if I go back to the console and I say document.querySelector and I say H1, we would expect to get our first H1, right? Which is the welcome. But check this out. If I say document.querySelector and I say hashtag blog, I'm actually going to get the second H1 because I'm saying grab something with the attribute, specifically an ID attribute of blog. Now, there are many different ways we can use queries in this case to grab the second of something if we want. This is probably the easiest and most targeted and specific, and something that you probably would see quite often. IDs, generally speaking, are supposed to be unique and only on one element anyway, so they make perfect sense to use with querySelector. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, again, just to really clarify, right, if I misspelled this, right, if I said like blog with 2 G's, for example, right, I would get back null. Because we get back null if our querySelector finishes the search, hits the end of the document, and doesn't find a node that matches that selector. It's specifically an element, I should say, that matches that selector. Okay, so what are these different selectors? I'm going to actually pull up a page on this MDM page, because this is actually very similar to the MDM page that I had earlier. So I'm just going to pull that up, and you can see that this is really the basic selectors. There are some things that I left out, because some of these are actually, you don't use them all the time technically. So I would probably still read through this because it's definitely going to go into more detail than I'm going to go into with you. But I think this is kind of the most basic that you should actually know. So when we're using querySelector, generally, we can search things by element tag name directly. So for example, we can search for a p tag, a span tag, a div, a table, just by using the actual tag name as a string. So for example, in this case, document.querySelector of p would return the first paragraph element on the document. We can search by ID like we just did by using the hashtag syntax, which is the same in CSS. So for example, I can do query selector of hashtag blog like we did to select the actual blog, which is this H1 right here. We can also search by classes, and classes generally can be shared with multiple different elements on the page. So again, this is only going to return the first match on the page from top down. So in this case, for a class, if you can imagine, for example, this div right here has a class called cat. If we did a query selector, we need to add a period and then the class name, just like the ID has a hashtag. So just specific syntax, very similar to CSS. So we do period cat, for example, and we get back this div tag right here, including the paragraph inside of it. Now, attributes are an interesting one. This becomes very powerful. And again, we use this in CSS a lot when targeting very specific elements. If we want to search for an attribute, we can actually surround that in square brackets, just like you would in CSS to select for that. So let me show you some examples of this just so it really makes some sense. So for example, for this div, I'm going to add a class of cat. Okay, and on this, let's say P tag over here, I'm going to add an attribute. I'm going to be kind of fancy here. I'll just add mobile, right? Now, not all attributes technically need to have a value associated to them. Technically, they can just have the key in this case, which in this case is mobile. Very similar to, I believe, like checked and a couple of other ones. Okay, so let's say that this one has class of cat, the div, and then P just has a regular attribute with no value called mobile. So how do we select these? So I'm going to come back to my hello page here. I'm going to reload the document, and I'm going to pull up my HTML or the elements tab. So here we can see that my div has a class of cat. My P has an attribute of mobile, and then we still have our ID of blog down here. So let's select each of these to see how they work. So we can do document.querySelector of hashtag blog to get our H1 blog, which is great. Then we can do document.querySelector, querySelector. I always misspell this for some reason, not really sure why. If we want to do classes, we can do cat like that, and that's going to give us the first match for something that has a class of cat. And notice that when I open this, it does have the actual nested elements inside of it. Okay, and then I can do document.querySelector, for example, and I can do, in here, I can put the attribute. So for example, in this case, mobile, and that will give me this paragraph, which has an attribute of mobile for the key. Right? So these are just very similar in CSS, just to give you a demo of how this would work so that it makes a bit of sense. I want to show you something really awesome though. All right, let's assume that I am going to try to assign this cat1 to a variable. So I'm going to say const cat is equal to document.querySelector of .cat. Okay, I'm going to clear this terminal so that I have some space. And let me just clear this terminal. So if I say cat, we can see that this is this div right here. Okay, now this is an element. Okay, querySelector gives us back an element. Just to prove this to you, I'm going to do a console.dir of my cat. And what we'll see is that this is a div element that has all of these properties on it. It has children, it has first child, an ID, last child, node value, all that kind of stuff, all the different events on it. This is literally a DOM element, specifically a div element. Okay, so if I say cat.nodeName, we'll see that it's a div. And if I do cat.nodeType, which we saw in the previous video as well, we'll see that it's an element type. Okay, so with that out of the way, I want to show you that we can actually search within this for the p tag. So if I say cat.querySelector, I am using querySelector on the element cat now. I'm not doing this on the document. And if I search for a p tag, I'm going to get that p inside of this div. Okay, notice if I search for an h1, I'm going to get back null. Even though there is another h1 on the page, it's not inside of this div tag, so we're not going to get anything back. So we are searching effectively this subtree of this div for an h1 and for a p, which is pretty awesome. Really, really powerful. We're going to be using this a lot as we start adding and removing things from the DOM as we get more advanced with the DOM different syntax. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense for the different selectors. Again, I encourage you to read through MDN, at least a cursory glance, just to make sure some of those make sense. Now, the second way that I've been holding off on you for how we can grab multiple nodes or elements when we're doing query selecting is that second method on elements as well as a document called querySelectorAll. As you can imagine, this gives us back all of the matches instead of just the first match, all right? Now, the difference with this is that we don't get back the single element, of course, we actually get back an array. Now, technically, it's actually not an array, it's something called a node list, which is an array-like element, which I'll show you in a second. But it's similar enough to an array that we can treat it for an array for a lot of different things. We can actually even turn it into an array and use things like map on it if we want, which I'll also show you. So with that out of the way though, before we get to those kind of more tricky examples of arrays and node lists, I just want to show you how this works. If you look at this example right here, we can see that this is the exact same thing that we have. But let's say that we want both of these H1s on the page. All right, we can do document.querySelectorAll, or technically any element that contains those things, for example, document.body in this case, and we can pass it the CSS selector, in this case, the H1 tag itself, and we will get back a node list. This is going to hunt down the entire document and match every single node and shove it into this node list for us until it reaches the bottom of the document. So in this particular case, since there's two H1s on the page, we're going to get them both back in an array-like thing called a node list where we can actually access them. So let me show you how this works. If I switch back to Chrome, I'm going to clear this console out. I'm going to do document.querySelectorAll. Okay, make sure we have the all here and just be careful with the camel case. Now, if I do P, just a P tag, notice that I get back a node list. Okay, and in this case, this node list has a single index, index 0, as you'd expect from an array, with a p tag in it, which is the actual element itself. In fact, if I highlight over it, you'll see, right, that this is the p tag, which is meow, right? Now, if I do document.querySelectorAll and I switch p for h1, notice I get back a node list of size 2 here, right? I get back the h1 right here, if I highlight over it, and then our blog h1 right here. Right? And you can see that as I move my mouse between these two, that they actually highlight in the DOM. Okay, now what is this node list thing? Let me assign this to a variable. So I'm going to say const h1s, I guess. H1's kind of a confusing one. This is an h1 and then an s, just to say the h1s. I'm going to say document.querySelectorAll, and then I'm going to say let's grab all the h1s. Okay, and I'm going to clear my console, just have some more room. I'm going to look at my H1s here, and that's our node list. Okay, now you would assume that with an array, you can index into it, and that would be correct. So if I grab index 0, I get back the H1. If I do index 1, in this case, I get back the blog. If I try to do something out of bounds, just like a regular array, I would get undefined. All right, but what we can't do is H1s dot, for example, map, right? I can't do map each element and then like console.log the element. This will not work. You can see that h1s.map is not a function. Okay, because map doesn't, sorry, not map, a node list, it doesn't actually have a map method on it. That is only on arrays in JavaScript, right? So let me just show you this. So if we look at node list, right, you can see that the prototype is not the not an array, right? It's actually a bit hard to see here on my screen, but it goes down directly to object from a node list. Okay, you can see that it has entries for each item, keys, and values, which is nice, right? But it doesn't have map, filter, and reduce, and the other array methods. Now, there's a way that we can turn this into an array, but for now, we'll just leave this as is, because this is what's called an array-like data structure, because it actually has indices just like this. Now, it's not the end of the world, because like I said, we can turn it into an array. We can do many things with this, and it's actually useful that it's a node list because it has other properties, but just be aware that it's not actually an array. So if you try to do things like map, filter, reduce, or other array methods, you have to first turn it into an array, which is quite a quick syntax. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's pretty much querySelectorAll. And if we give it, for example, let me just switch back to my search over here. So if I do querySelectorAll and I say H2s, for example, you can see that we still get back a node list, but this node list has a length of 0. So unlike querySelector, right, where if we don't find anything, we get back null, right? querySelectorAll, if we don't find anything, we just get back an empty array. So just be aware of those differences, okay? querySelector, we find something, we get back the element directly. We don't find anything, we get back null. querySelectorAll, if we find something, it's in an array. We can have many things in there or one thing. We can also have 0 things if we find nothing, but it's not going to be null. Okay, cool. So hopefully that makes sense. Now to wrap up this video, I just want to show you kind of my opinion on some of these other resources that we have when it comes to searching documents that you might see around, because you'll definitely see these as you're coding on teams or working with legacy code. So there actually are other ways to search the DOM other than querySelector and querySelectorAll. If you've seen these before, fantastic. If you haven't, definitely take heed to kind of what I'm saying right now, because it probably will help you out as you are going forward with your HTML, CSS, and DOM journey. So in this case, you can see that I have these two methods that we actually looked at together throughout this video, querySelector and querySelectorAll. I think that these are the kind of go-to de facto methods that you need to use when you're searching the DOM. You can do everything with them. You don't need any other methods. And I think you should only stick to these two methods and not go through these other methods that I'm going to mention in a second. I'll mention why. The other methods that you might see, especially when working with older projects or backwards compatibility things, or sometimes team members like to use these because maybe they don't know about querySelector as much, or they're not as comfortable with it. You might see things like getElementById, getElements by class name, getElements by tag name, or getElements by name, hence the, notice the singular and plurals there. These all work, and they kind of do as you'd expect what their names imply. These were originally in JavaScript and the DOM API way back, pretty much since we have been working with the DOM, and querySelector and querySelectorAll are quite new. So why am I suggesting not to use these older methods and to use these newer methods? Well, querySelector and querySelectorAll are really powerful. I think the most important thing is, as a developer, we should be we should scope down the amount of things we need to memorize and learn. So that when we're moving between different technologies, for example, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, or working the DOM in this case, our brain isn't kind of all like kerfuzzled and like all over the place, right? querySelector and querySelectorAll allow us to use CSS selectors to actually do our querying, right? So if you're writing CSS, it's very easy to understand what you're selecting, right? And chances are, if you're doing front-end development and working with the DOM, there's a high chance you are working at least with the basics of CSS. These can be really, really powerful selectors. As you saw, we can do things like attributes and nested components, and parents and children. We can jump to find like the nth of an element. All these different CSS things that we can do in CSS, we have available to us in querySelector and querySelectorAll. You cannot do those things with these other methods as they are more limited. So to keep within the same context and to also add a little bit of more power to your repertoire, I highly encourage querySelector and querySelectorAll. There are edge cases where the other ones might be better in specific contexts, but it's very rare that you'd ever run into those. And if you did run into those situations, you could just switch and you would know exactly why. These days, that's very rare. For example, working with older browsers is one case where you might use something like getElementById, where querySelector might not be available on super old browsers. However, generally these days we use tools like Babel that actually take our newer code and turn it into older code behind the scenes for us automatically. So our code runs on every browser using kind of the oldest version of JavaScript pretty much no matter what. So we don't really have to worry about that as much these days. That said, querySelector is really available in pretty much all modern browsers anyways. It's actually from Chrome, I think, from version 1, which should tell you something. So definitely use it and keep your mind within the same context, just so you're not too scatterbrained when you're working with these different APIs, since there's already a lot of them to memorize. Okay, I hope you found this video useful. It was definitely fun to make and kind of explain. If you did like it, I'd appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments, have you used querySelector and querySelectorAll? Do you mainly use these other ones? What did you think of the power behind it? Do you like the idea of using CSS selectors to select things from the DOM? Can you think of really complicated ones? As we kind of go forward, we're going to be working with really kind of complex like trees and shadow trees and web components and things like that, where query selectors are going to be very, very valuable for us to actually choose and target different parts of the DOM. And it just becomes more natural as you use it, especially when you're mixing in CSS and you're working with that alongside it. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to go over some exercises to practice with querySelector and selecting things from the DOM. And this is again part of a series where we're going to do things like being able to select things from a DOM, then manipulate things in the DOM and delete things from the DOM, as well as create our own elements in the DOM. Okay, so we're kind of slowly working through these steps so that really the entire DOM is kind of at our fingertips and at our disposal, and we can create we can actually create an entire DOM from scratch and put it into a web page, and that's pretty remarkable, and we can do some pretty powerful things with that. So super excited to get to the exercises for this. I will see you in the query selector exercises next. See you later.